Thank you very much, Margarita. That's so kind of you. And thank you very much, everybody who's here with us today. Thank you for honoring this invitation. It's a pleasure being here with you to deliberate on what equitable budgeting is. So to set the ball rolling, I want to start from the very beginning, and that is, what is a budget? When we say budgets, what exactly are we talking about? A budget is the government's most important economic policy tool. For those of us who may not know, and for those who know, well, we know that a budget translates government policies, political commitments, and goals into decisions on how to use revenues and other sources of funding. Why? To meet the state's competing needs. In essence, a budget simply means put your money where your mouth is. What are your needs? And how do we translate all of these policies and political commitments and goals on how to use revenues to meet these needs? That precisely is what a budget is. And then, having said that, what is equity? Equity is a concept that helps us to decide how to distribute goods and services across society. And we have to do this in such a way that ensures fair treatment for all citizens and mitigates conflict. As you can see, equity suggests a concept that is fair and reasonable. It is not the same as equality. Equitable does not just divide things into halves. It takes into account other factors which may justify one group getting more than the other. And of course, this is based on the vulnerabilities of the group, the vulnerabilities of the people concerned. So invariably, there's a correlation between equity and the level of conflict, be it physical, cultural, or structural violence in any society. The more equitable a society is, the more peaceful there is, the less conflict there is. So we cannot afford to treat everybody the same. We must recognize that there are differences between the different groups of people and treat them equitably. That is what equity is. It's important to stress that equity leads to equality and not vice versa. As you can see from the picture, there are differently abled persons, there are those who are vulnerable, there are those who are elderly, there are those who, there are different classes of people in this society. Excuse me. And we cannot, as I said earlier on, treat them equally. If we have to work in such a way, allocate resources, let the budget recognize that for each individual to reach their maximum potential, to be treated fairly and justly, then there must be equitable allocation of resources. When we treat people equally, the outcomes are not fair. Having said that, we're moving on to inclusion. What is inclusion? What exactly do we mean when we say inclusion? We'll start with the more familiar term, and that is exclusion. Social exclusion, let us begin with that. Social exclusion is when certain groups are systematically disadvantaged because they are discriminated against. And this brings to mind what is going on the global scene right now. There are many cities around the world that are seeing riots and violence and a lot of frustration and anger from people who have been discriminated against. That gives us a very clear picture of what it means to be socially excluded. Discrimination can be on the basis of your ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, caste, descent, gender, disability. There are many factors that can make the society discriminate against you. And what happens is legal systems and education and health services, as well as social institutions, when they begin to discriminate against certain groups of people or individual, and there's that feeling of extreme frustration, then the result is grievances towards the state, and this fuels conflict. So having said that about exclusion, what therefore is inclusion? Inclusion is the reverse of exclusion. It is the deliberate process where conscious efforts are made to provide for those who are marginalized and disadvantaged and make sure that they have access to assets and social justice. The excluded people, the next picture actually gives a very graphic description of what it means to be excluded by, for instance, disability. As we can see, the picture is one of a public library, and that is simply representation. It could be a public hospital, it could be school, it could be a school, it could be any institution whatsoever that is open to the public, but discriminates against persons with disability. How can we expect this person in the wheelchair to navigate those steps? The situation becomes so much worse when, for instance, it is a woman who's sitting in that wheelchair. She could be somebody's wife. Who's going to carry her? What if she has a period? So even in cases of disability, gender plays a very, very big role. And so we must recognize that in the society, people are differently abled, persons have different vulnerabilities, and the system, there's systemic discrimination against various groups of people because of their vulnerabilities. And so let's take a further look at equitable and inclusiveness. What does this really mean in practical terms? One size does not fit all. It is about time for us to recognize that one size does not fit all. This is a pictorial representation of, for instance, allocation of resources. We may think that we are being fair, we're being just by giving everybody the same thing, but until and unless we recognize that we are not all the same, and so our needs need to be met differently. They're children, they're women, they're elderly people, they're persons with disability who exist in a society, and therefore the budget and all the systems, the mechanisms and the systems of the state must recognize these differences and value them accordingly. Having said that now, we're looking at what therefore are the goals of an equitable budget. When we say that a budget is equitable, why? What is the goal? The goals of an equitable budget will vary according to the political and social context of each state. Because again, one size does not fit all, the states are not the same. And so what constitutes equity in this instance may not be what constitutes equity in the other instance. However, the underlying theme through all of it is that equitable budgets must aspire to make governments accountable. They must raise awareness among the citizens, and they must always promote equity and peaceful societies. Those are the three major goals of an equitable budget. They must aspire to make governments accountable, raise awareness among the citizens, and promote equity and peaceful societies. Having said that, why is equitable and socially inclusive budgeting important? What's the reason behind this? I think by now I've alluded to this in several terms, in several ways, but when a budget is equitable and socially inclusive, it means that it considers the different needs of men and women and other groups of persons. It recognizes the differential impact of policies on each group. For so long, policies do not consider that the impact on a man is different from the impact on a woman, and it is different from the impact on young people or persons with disability or aged people. Policies are blind And so the differential impacts have never been measured or never been taken into account. When your budget or your policy instruments, when they become equitable and socially inclusive, that means that we recognize the differential impacts on each group and we begin to work with that knowledge. It ensures that all citizens are catered for in the areas of public finance. It is essential because it ensures that the needs of the poor, the vulnerable, those with disabilities, and those who may be marginalized and excluded from the mainstream, their needs are better reflected in public policy making, especially in the government budget. That is why equitable and socially inclusive budgeting is important, because we recognize all the elements of the society and we carry them along with us. Thank you very much. At this point, I will now hand over to Chris, who will be taking us through the PERL Equitable Budgeting Guide. Thank you.